What if the struggling mechanic who helped you was actually a billionaire in hiding? Would you believe it? This is the story of Claire, a woman stranded on the roadside, and Jack, the man who came to her rescue, only for her to uncover a truth that would change both their lives forever. Stay till the end, because this story is full of shocking twists, deep emotions, and a secret that no one saw coming. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the quiet highway. Claire Matthews let out a frustrated sigh as she leaned over the hood of her car, staring at the steaming engine like it might suddenly fix itself. "Great, just great," she muttered, wiping sweat from her forehead. She had been on her way to an important business meeting, one that could change everything for her career. But now, she was stranded in the middle of nowhere, with barely any battery left on her phone and no idea how to fix a broken-down car. She tapped at her phone screen. 1% battery remaining. "Of course," she groaned. Just as she was about to accept that she might be stuck here for hours, the sound of approaching footsteps made her turn. A man in grease-stained overalls walked toward her, wiping his hands on a rag. He was tall, with strong arms, dark tousled hair, and a jawline that looked like it had seen better days. "Need some help?" he asked, his deep voice carrying a hint of exhaustion. Claire hesitated. She had always been cautious around strangers, but at this point, she didn't have much of a choice. "Yeah," she sighed. "I think it overheated, and I have no idea what to do." The man gave a small nod and walked past her to peer under the hood. He poked around the engine for a moment before glancing at her. "Looks like a busted radiator hose," he said. "I can patch it up temporarily, but you'll need a replacement soon." Claire exhaled in relief. "That would be amazing. Thank you. What's your name?" "Jack," he said simply before getting to work. Claire watched Jack as he moved efficiently, his hands working with practiced ease. He didn't look like the typical mechanic. There was something about him, something worn, something haunted. "Do you own the garage nearby?" she asked, trying to fill the silence. Jack shook his head. "Nah, just work there." There was a quietness to him, like he didn't want to say much more. Claire didn't push. Instead, she watched as he finished patching the radiator hose. "That should hold for a while," Jack finally said, wiping his hands. "You'll make it into town, but get replaced soon." Claire smiled, reaching for her purse. "How much do I owe you?" Jack shook his head. "Don't worry about it." Claire frowned. "Come on, I can't just take your help for free." Jack let out a small chuckle, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say, sometimes, it's nice to help someone without expecting anything in return." Something about the way he said it made Claire's heart tighten. She didn't know why, but she felt like this man had been through a lot more than he let on. "Well, thank you, Jack. I appreciate it," she said sincerely. Jack gave her a small nod and turned to walk back to the garage. As Claire got into her car and started the engine, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Jack than he was letting on. And for some reason, she wanted to find out what. That night, after checking into a motel in town, Claire couldn't stop thinking about Jack. There was something familiar about his face, something that nagged at the back of her mind. Curiosity got the best of her. She grabbed her phone and typed in his name. Jack Mechanic, small town garage. Nothing. She frowned and tried again. This time, she added the word past at the end. The moment she hit search, an old news article popped up. Her breath caught in her throat. Billionaire heir Jack Callahan walks away from fortune after wife's tragic death. Claire stared at the screen, reading and rereading the words. Jack wasn't just a mechanic. He was the heir to a multi-billion-dollar empire, and he had walked away from it all. But why? Claire's heart pounded as she scrolled through the article. According to the reports, Jack had vanished after his wife's sudden death. The Callahan family's fortune was built on luxury hotels, real estate, and investments, but Jack had chosen to disappear rather than inherit it all. The article speculated about his whereabouts, but no one had been able to find him. Until now. Claire's hand shook as she lowered her phone. The struggling single dad who had fixed her car wasn't just an ordinary man. He was a billionaire in hiding. Claire stared at the glowing screen of her phone, her heart pounding in her chest. Jack Callahan, a billionaire heir who had walked away from everything. Her mind raced with questions. Why had he left? Why was he working in a tiny garage, fixing cars instead of managing a corporate empire? And most importantly, why had no one been able to find him until now? Claire knew she shouldn't get involved. But something about Jack intrigued her, something deeper than just the shock of discovering his past. He had been kind to her. He had helped her without expecting anything in return. And now, she felt like she owed him something. The next morning, Claire made her way back to the garage. Jack was outside, working on an old truck, his sleeves rolled up, grease staining his strong arms. He looked up as she approached, his eyes narrowing slightly in surprise. "You're back," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. Claire took a deep breath. "I needed to ask you something." Jack sighed. "I figured." She hesitated for a moment before pulling out her phone and holding it up. The article about him was still on the screen. Jack's entire body tensed. His jaw clenched. His hands curled into fists. "Where did you get that?" His voice was low, almost dangerous. Claire swallowed hard. "It's public information, Jack. I just searched your name." Jack exhaled sharply, turning away. "You shouldn't have done that." Claire took a step closer. "I just don't understand. Why would you walk away from all of that? From billions of dollars? From everything?" Jack was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Because money means nothing when you've lost everything that matters." Claire frowned. "What do you mean?" Jack turned to look at her, and for the first time, she saw the raw pain in his eyes. "My wife died because of that fortune," he said quietly. "Because of the greed, the pressure, the world I was born into. And I couldn't stay in it anymore. I had to leave, for my daughter's sake." Claire's breath caught in her throat. His daughter. She had read about his wife's tragic accident, but she hadn't realized he had a child. Jack rubbed a hand over his face. "I don't expect you to understand, but I made my choice, and I don't regret it." Claire watched him carefully. He was trying so hard to keep his walls up, but she could see the cracks. "You gave up everything to protect her, didn't you?" she asked softly. Jack didn't answer, but he didn't have to. Claire felt a strange mix of emotions: admiration, sympathy, curiosity. She had met plenty of rich men before, but none like Jack. None who had given it all up for something greater than money. And now, she couldn't stop wondering, if she found him so easily, who else might be looking for him? And what would happen if they did? Before Claire could ask another question, a soft voice called from inside the garage. "Daddy." Claire turned toward the sound and saw a little girl standing in the doorway. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old, with dark curls framing her tiny face and big blue eyes that looked eerily like Jack's. She clutched a worn-out stuffed bunny in one hand, rubbing her sleepy eyes with the other. Jack's entire demeanor softened in an instant. The roughness in his expression melted as he crouched down and opened his arms. "Hey, sweetheart," he said gently. "Did I wake you up?" The little girl shook her head and toddled toward him, wrapping her small arms around his neck. Jack lifted her effortlessly, holding her close as she buried her face against his shoulder. Claire felt something tighten in her chest. She had never seen a man look at anyone the way Jack looked at his daughter, with pure, unconditional love. "This is Emily," Jack said, glancing at Claire. Claire smiled. "Hi, Emily." The little girl peeked at her shyly, then whispered something in Jack's ear. He chuckled and nodded. "She says she likes your hair," Jack translated. Claire laughed, touching her curls. "Well, I think Emily's hair is much prettier than mine." Emily giggled softly, hiding her face again. Jack kissed the top of her head before looking back at Claire. "Now do you understand?" Claire nodded. "Yeah, I do." Jack had given up billions to raise his daughter away from the pressures of wealth and greed. He had chosen a life of simplicity, not because he was running, but because he was protecting her. But something still didn't sit right. "If I could find you, Jack," she said carefully, "that means others can too." Jack's expression darkened. "I know. And that's what scared him the most." Claire didn't mean to keep digging, but she couldn't help herself. That night, back at her motel, she searched again. There were more articles about Jack's disappearance. rumors, speculations, and then she found something new. Callahan family urgently searching for missing heir, company in crisis. Claire's eyes widened as she scanned the details. Jack's father, Richard Callahan, was on the verge of losing control of their billion-dollar company. Investors were panicking, and they wanted Jack to return, whether he liked it or not. Claire bit her lip. If his family was getting desperate, would they come looking for him? A chill ran down her spine. Jack had spent years hiding from them, but now it looked like time was running out, and he had no idea. Claire couldn't sleep. The article she had read kept replaying in her mind. Jack's family was searching for him, and from the way it sounded, they weren't going to stop until they found him. She glanced at her phone. Should she tell him? She had only met Jack yesterday, but something inside her refused to ignore the situation. She had seen the love in his eyes when he looked at Emily. He had sacrificed everything to give his daughter a normal life, and now that life was at risk. Claire exhaled sharply and grabbed her jacket. She had to warn him. Jack was closing up the garage when Claire pulled into the lot. He looked up in surprise as she hurried toward him. Claire, he wiped his hands on a rag. What's wrong? She hesitated, unsure how to start. I found something, Jack, about your family. His expression hardened instantly. I don't want to know. You need to, she insisted. They're looking for you. Your father is losing control of the company, and now the media is all over it. Jack let out a bitter laugh. Of course they are. Not because they care about me, just about their empire. Claire stepped closer. Jack, if I found this information, someone else will too. You're not as hidden as you think. Jack ran a hand through his hair, frustration flashing in his eyes. I left that world behind for a reason. I don't care what happens to their business. But they care, Claire said firmly, and they won't stop until they get what they want. Jack fell silent, his jaw tightening, and then, as if on cue, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and stared at the screen. His expression darkened. Unknown number. Jack's stomach dropped. Hello? His voice was cautious. A pause. Then a familiar voice spoke. Jack, it's time to come home. His grip on the phone tightened. We know where you are. Jack's mind raced. He had been careful, so careful, and yet they had found him. His father's voice was calm, but Jack knew better. Richard Callahan was a man who took no for an answer. You should have left me alone, Jack said coldly. You belong to this family, whether you like it or not, his father replied, and we're giving you a choice. Come willingly, or we'll make sure you have no other option. Jack's fist clenched. His heart pounded. He glanced at Claire, who was watching him with wide, worried eyes. Emily was asleep inside. She had no idea what was happening. He had worked so hard to keep her safe. And now, everything was falling apart. Don't come near my daughter, Jack warned. His father sighed. We'll be in town by morning. I suggest you be ready. The line went dead. Jack lowered the phone, his body rigid with anger. Claire stepped forward. Jack, what are you going to do? Jack's jaw tightened. I won't let them take her from me. Claire swallowed hard. Then we have to fight back. Jack stood in the dimly lit garage, his mind racing. He had spent years staying hidden, building a quiet life for Emily, and now it was all unraveling. His father was coming, and that meant he had little time to act. Claire watched him carefully. Jack, you can't just wait for them to show up. He exhaled sharply. I know. I need to get Emily out of here. Claire hesitated. Where will you go? Jack ran a hand through his hair. He had contacts, people who owed him favors, but nowhere felt safe anymore. His father had resources beyond what he could fight, but he wasn't going to let them win. We leave tonight, Jack decided. I'll pack what we need and disappear again. Claire frowned. Jack, I get why you're running, but you can't keep running forever. Emily deserves stability. Jack turned to her, his eyes flashing. And you think she'd be stable in the billionaire's world? Surrounded by people who only see her as an heir, not a child. Claire didn't back down. I think she deserves a father who isn't living in fear. Jack opened his mouth to argue, but a soft voice interrupted them. Daddy? Emily stood in the doorway, rubbing her sleepy eyes. Jack immediately softened. He crouched down, opening his arms, and Emily rushed into them. "Why are you awake, sweetheart?" he asked gently. Emily peeked up at him. "I heard you talking." Jack kissed the top of her head. "Everything's okay, baby. We just have to go on a little trip." Emily yawned and nodded trustingly. Claire's heart squeezed at the sight. She couldn't let Jack face this alone. "I'm coming with you," she said. Jack blinked. "Claire." "I can help," she insisted. "You might be good at running, but I'm good at thinking ahead." Jack studied her for a moment, then sighed. "All right, but if things get dangerous, you walk away. No arguments." Claire crossed her arms. "Not a chance." Jack almost smiled. Almost. Then he stood. "Let's move." Time was running out. They packed quickly. Claire threw together a small bag, while Jack grabbed a few essentials for Emily. Within an hour, they were on the road. Jack drove, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. Claire sat in the passenger seat, while Emily slept in the back, curled up with her stuffed bunny. As the town faded behind them, Claire exhaled. "Do you think they're already looking for you?" Jack's jaw tightened. "They don't need to look. My father knows exactly where I am." "Then what's the plan?" Jack glanced at her. "We get somewhere safe. Then I figure out how to stop this for good." Claire frowned. "And how do you do that?" Jack didn't answer, because truthfully he didn't know. But one thing was certain. He would never let them take Emily, even if it meant risking everything. Jack drove for hours, the highway stretching endlessly before them. The night was dark and quiet, but his mind was anything but. Every few minutes, he checked the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see black SUVs tailing them. Claire watched him cautiously. "Jack, where are we going?" "A safe house," he said. "A place I set up years ago, in case I ever needed to disappear." Claire frowned. "You had an escape plan this whole time?" Jack sighed. "I always knew my past might catch up with me. I didn't plan to run forever, but I needed a backup if it ever came to this." Claire glanced back at Emily, who was still peacefully asleep. "She's gonna need stability, Jack, not just running from place to place." "I know," Jack admitted. "That's why this is an end." By the time they reached the secluded cabin, the sky was turning a deep shade of blue. The house was tucked deep in the woods, hidden from the road. Jack had bought it under a false name years ago. No paper trail, no way for his family to track him here. For now it was safe. Jack carried Emily inside, settling her onto a small bed. She stirred slightly but didn't wake. He tucked her in, brushing a curl from her forehead. Claire stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "What now?" Jack leaned against the wall, exhausted. "Now we wait. If they're following, they won't find us easily." Claire hesitated. "And if they do?" Jack's eyes darkened. "Then I fight." Claire stepped closer. "Jack, if they're this desperate to bring you back, do you really think they'll stop at just finding you?" Jack clenched his jaw. "No, but I won't let them near Emily." Claire sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Then maybe it's time to stop running. Time to face this head on." Jack exhaled sharply. "You think I haven't considered that?" "Then why don't you?" she challenged. Jack looked past her, at his sleeping daughter. "Because I can't risk her getting caught in the middle." Claire's expression softened. "Then let me help." Jack met her gaze. She wasn't backing down. And for the first time in years, he realized maybe he didn't have to do this alone. Jack stood frozen, gripping his phone tightly. His father's words echoed in his mind. "You have one day. Come back willingly, or I take matters into my own hands." He knew exactly what that meant. Richard Callahan was a man of power and influence. If he wanted something, he got it, no matter who stood in his way. Claire stepped closer. "Jack, what did he say?" Jack exhaled sharply. "He's given me a choice. Go back on my own, or he forces my hand." Claire's face paled. "And what does forcing your hand look like?" Jack clenched his jaw. "I don't know, but I won't wait around to find out." She crossed her arms. "Then what do we do?" Jack looked past her, toward the small cabin where Emily was still peacefully asleep. We end this, he said. Claire frowned. How? Jack met her gaze. I need to go back and face him. Claire's eyes widened. Jack, no. That's exactly what he wants. Jack shook his head. I won't let him dictate my life anymore. And I won't let him threaten Emily. Claire grabbed his arm. Then let me go with you. Jack hesitated. Claire, I'm serious, she interrupted. You don't have to do this alone. Jack stared at her for a long moment. Then finally he nodded. All right, he said. We do this together. Jack left Emily in the care of an old friend, someone he trusted completely. Then, with Claire by his side, he made the drive back to the city. It had been years since he last set foot in his family's world. The towering skyscrapers, the pristine streets. Everything was just as he remembered it. Yet, he felt like a stranger here. Claire glanced at him as they pulled up in front of Callahan Enterprises. Are you sure about this? Jack's hands tightened around the wheel. No, but I don't have a choice. Together, they stepped out of the car and walked to the grand glass doors. The receptionist looked up, her eyes widening in shock. Mr. Callahan? Jack ignored her reaction and strode toward the elevators, Claire keeping pace beside him. He knew exactly where he was going. Straight to the top. The doors to Richard Callahan's office swung open, and Jack stepped inside. His father sat behind an enormous mahogany desk, looking every bit as powerful as Jack remembered. Jack, Richard said smoothly, you finally came to your senses. Jack didn't waste time. Leave Emily alone. Richard sighed, leaning back in his chair. Jack, you're being emotional. I only want what's best for her. Jack's fists clenched. She has what's best for her. A father who loves her. A life away from this toxic empire you built. Richard's expression darkened. And what future does she have with you? Living in rundown motels? Barely scraping by? Jack took a step forward. A future where she's free. Where she's happy. Richard's eyes flickered toward Claire, as if noticing her for the first time. And who's this? Claire lifted her chin. Someone who actually cares about Jack and Emily. Richard smirked. Ah, so you found a new ally. How touching. Jack took a deep breath. I'm not here to argue. I'm here to make something clear. You will leave Emily alone. Forever. Richard steepled his fingers. And if I don't... Jack's voice was like steel. Then I expose everything. The illegal dealings. The corruption. Everything you spent decades hiding. Richard's face remained unreadable, but Jack could see the tension in his jaw. For the first time, his father looked truly uncertain, and Jack knew he had finally gained the upper hand. Claire narrowed her eyes. And how? Jack didn't answer, because deep down he knew the truth. There was only one way this would end. He had to face his father. Jack drove for hours, the highway stretching endlessly before them. The night was dark and quiet, but his mind was anything but. Every few minutes, he checked the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see black SUVs tailing them. Claire watched him cautiously. Jack, where are we going? A safe house, he said. A place I set up years ago, in case I ever needed to disappear. Claire frowned. You had an escape plan this whole time? Jack sighed. I always knew my past might catch up with me. I didn't plan to run forever, but I needed a backup if it ever came to this. Claire glanced back at Emily, who was still peacefully asleep. She was going to need stability, Jack, not just running from place to place. I know, Jack admitted. That's why this is the end. Claire narrowed her eyes. And how? Jack didn't answer, because deep down he knew the truth. There was only one way this would end. He had to face his father. A heavy silence settled over the room. Jack had never seen his father hesitate before, and that alone told him he had struck a nerve. Richard's expression remained neutral, but his fingers tapped against his desk, a small tell that Jack recognized from childhood. His father was calculating his next move. You think you can take me down? Richard finally said, his voice measured. I built this empire, Jack. You wouldn't last a second trying to bring it down. Jack met his gaze, unwavering. You don't get control me anymore, and you will never control Emily. Richard's smirk returned. And what if I simply remove you from the picture? Claire stiffened beside Jack, But Jack didn't flinch. He knew exactly what his father was capable of. "You could try," Jack said, his voice calm. "But if anything happens to me, I've made sure the truth about you comes out. Every dirty secret, every crime you covered up. If I disappear, the world will know exactly who Richard Callahan really is." His father's smirk faltered. Just for a second. Jack had planned for this moment. Years ago, when he first ran, he had collected evidence. Documents, recordings, testimonies. Everything he needed to bring his father's empire crumbling down. Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Then he exhaled slowly. "You've changed, Jack. I didn't think you had this in you." Jack held his ground. "I had to change. To protect my daughter." His father drummed his fingers on the desk. Then, with a tired sigh, he waved a hand. "Fine. You win." Jack narrowed his eyes. "What?" Richard leaned forward. "I'll back off. Emily stays with you." Jack didn't move. He knew better than to trust his father so easily. And in return, Richard's lips curled into a smirk. "You stay out of my business. No threats, no exposing me. You and Emily disappear for good, and I pretend you don't exist." Jack considered the deal carefully. He had always wanted to escape his father's shadow, to build a life where Emily was safe, and now he had that chance. But could he trust Richard to keep his word? Jack and Claire walked out of Callahan Enterprises, the weight of years of fear and control finally lifting from Jack's shoulders. For the first time, he was truly free. As they got into the car, Claire glanced at him. "Do you believe him?" Jack let out a breath. "Not entirely, but I have the legal documents now. He can't come after Emily without exposing himself." Claire nodded, but her expression was still tense. "So what now?" Jack started the engine, glancing at her with a small smile. "Now we go home." Claire blinked in surprise. "Home?" Jack nodded. "Not just a temporary hideout. A real home. A place where Emily can grow up safe and happy." Claire's lips curled into a smile. "That sounds perfect." Jack reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "And I want you there with us." Claire's breath hitched. "Are you sure?" Jack nodded. "Claire, you stood by me when you didn't have to. You fought for me, for Emily. I don't want to do this without you." Tears welled in Claire's eyes, but she smiled. "Then let's go home." Back in the city, Richard Callahan sat in his office, staring at the signed documents before him. Jack was gone. Forever. For years, Richard had controlled everything and everyone around him. But now, he had lost the one thing he never thought he would, his son. He exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. Jack had won, and for the first time in his life, Richard Callahan felt something unfamiliar. Regret. Some battles are won not by fighting, but by walking away. Jack chose love over power, freedom over control, and in the end, he found the only thing that truly mattered, family. If you loved this story, don't forget to like, share, and comment below. Would you have made the same choice as Jack? Let us know.